Okay, so welcome to our third installment of Recovery Month interviews. I'm Lori Lauritsen with LL Counseling and Wellness. I'm a licensed mental health counselor, master certified addictions professional, and certified yoga teacher. My practice is blending science and holistic practices to help you heal mind, body, and spirit. And this is September Recovery Month. So this month I have been sharing experience, strength, and hope with you with people that I care about that have long-term recovery that are willing to take that risk and share their story so that you can see that it's possible. You know, whether you're a family member who has a loved one that's still struggling with addiction, or whether you have been in and out of recovery, or not quite sure if you have a problem yet, you know, whatever the case may be for you, I wanted there to be a place for you to see what's possible. So I have another one of my good friends and colleagues here, Brandon, that has been so graciously willing to share his story. And he's such an amazing person that I respect so much. And I am super excited to hear what he has to say. So as per usual, I'm pretty flexible with my interviews. You know, it's you share as much or as little as you want to. We kind of start with a background of how did you get here? What's your story? And then if I may interrupt here and there and ask questions or things like that, and we'll just kind of go from there.
Awesome. Sounds great. I appreciate it, Lori.
Oh yeah.
First I want to start out by just thanking you for the opportunity, to use what you know about recovery and the work that you do as a professional to, share resources with individuals. And like you said, just to let other people know that, number one is recovery is possible, and two, you're not alone. So thank you so much. I know we've known each other for a couple of years, and I think it's our the way that we met. I think I wanted to share that. I was thinking about that tonight, and
Sure.
we met through a little networking group, but I think there was a very important part in just kind of our relationship that made me just have a whole bunch of respect for you from the bottom of my heart. We were at a conference in Orlando, and I had the first ever panic attack that I've ever had in my entire life, and I mean full-fledged panic attack. I thought we had to call an ambulance, and I saw you coming from across the distance, and I locked on, and you helped me kind of process that panic attack in real time using the techniques that as a therapist, using some of the other cool things that you do with the doTERRA essential oils. And I'll be forever grateful for that, because if you wouldn't have been there, my phone was ready to call 911. So thank you. It's funny how we meet people in this, in recovery, in this role, and just kind of in general. So I just wanted to make sure I shared that about you, because you are an amazing professional, and I really appreciate this
Oh,
opportunity.
thank you. Absolutely. I'm so glad I was able to be there for you for that. And that's such a great story for me to have, just a reminder that I change lives too, that I help support people. You
Right?
don't always get those stories because it's hard when people are struggling with the disease of addiction. It's challenging.
Yeah.
So it's nice to hear stuff like that. So thank you so much for sharing that.
Yeah, yeah, you bet. And I think, I'll do my best to keep this as concise and as precise as possible. Um, how did I get here? I think that's an amazing question, right? How did I get to where I am today? It's, September 28th, 2021. It's almost 8 o'clock at night. And just kind of thinking about my journey and my story and recovery, I think, January 14th, 2008, is the first day that I got clean. Or excuse me, 1/15/08 is my clean date. January 14th is the night I had overdosed at my parents' house. And so there's a lot of things that led up to that specific evening, but I remember it very well. I think for me, a lot of what I've had to do is really look at, my childhood, how I was raised, how I was brought up. I think a lot of what I've learned through working a program of recovery and being a member of a 12-step fellowship, I think I've had an amazing opportunity to take a look at how did I get to where I am today. So it's an impactful and powerful question. My mind kind of goes to early on in childhood, right? Not feeling comfortable in my own skin, really not identifying with, my friends and the other people that I was growing up with. I had an amazing family, and I still do, that have always been with me to support me along the way. But I can remember some pretty significant childhood interactions, experiences, if you call them that, where, I went through different phases of trying to change who I was on the outside because I didn't know who I was on the inside. Early on in grade school and through high school, I was a jock. I played football up until about 11th grade. That's when things really started to escalate for me. I was a skateboarder. I wore Jinko jeans. I had a chain wallet. I was a punk for a while. I had manic panic, listened to Rancid. I didn't really know how to fit in. So for every different group of friends, I would put on a mask to interact with them and to feel like I was part of something, because I think I just didn't know who I was from early on. And knowing that today, I think is very important, because, even though individuals can find recovery, stay in recovery, and have this beautiful life, I think there are still things that we learn from our past throughout that recovery process. There's a couple of significant events for me in high school, in the later parts of high school, that were very traumatic in nature. They had to do, with relationships, with losses of individuals and friends. And, even then I didn't know how to cope with my emotions. I didn't know how to tell my mom and dad, or, my friends, that I'm sad, I'm scared, I'm lonely, I'm isolating. I don't know what to do with these feelings. And so right around the age 14 is when I started to really just kind of experiment with whatever it was I could get my hands on. Very early on, I was introduced to a lot of the stuff that most people are introduced to, like cigarettes. Now it's vape pens and all these other interesting vehicles for using substances. But, it started just gradual, with a couple of things here and a couple of things there. And then, it started to kind of spiral out of control. I think there was a couple of contributing factors. Number one, me just being a punk kid, not listening to my parents, wanting to fight authority, and wanting to feel really cool. So I let people take advantage of me a lot. I was a people pleaser. I was extremely codependent. I always joke that when I got into recovery, I identified myself as, I'm an addict, I'm an alcoholic, and I'm a codependent, because I was all of those things, and I didn't know how to identify exactly who I was or what I was until I found recovery. But, in high school and those later years, started also experimenting with other drugs. And I grew up in a small rural town up in Brainerd, Minnesota, the home of Paul Bunyan, which you guys are probably all familiar with. But, I had a really good childhood. I really don't have too many complaints around, a lot of the stuff that other individuals have, because my parents were always there for me. My little sister always cared for me, and she came to one of my first recovery meetings with me when I got 30 days. So I've always been grateful. But I think there are some things where I started to pull away, and I started to really not know who I was and not be able to communicate my feelings, my thoughts, and my emotions with the people that were most close to me, right? I think that's one thing that I've learned, is that through our using, whether it's drugs or alcohol or whatever you put a name on it, we tend to focus so much, and I focus so much on getting and finding whatever I could and using as much as I could. I started to let go of obligations. I started not showing up to work. I started not going to church on Sunday. I stopped all of these things that, now looking back at, was part of my escalation or experimentation into substances. But, I continued to use until I was 24. At 24, again, January 14th, 2008 is the third and kind of final overdose that I've had. And I remember it very clearly. And I think I learned early on in recovery that, it's important for me to remember that experience, because it was very impactful and very powerful for me. I was at my parents' house. I had taken a bunch of different things. I was taking pills and, using all sorts of different things. I really didn't have a preference. I was kind of a human garbage can for a while there. But, I started to black out. I was kind of going in and out of consciousness. I was trying to sleep it off, and I was in the spare bedroom right across from my parents' bedroom. And I remember at one point I got up, I went to the bathroom, and I was standing there. I'm like looking at myself in the mirror, and I had no idea who I was looking at. Like I felt like I was looking at a complete ghost. My eyes were black. It was literally like I had no soul, or my soul had left my body. And that's all I remember before I woke up in the ICU. And that experience was very traumatic. I think more so for my mom and dad because they were there. Apparently I had tried to leave multiple times, and my dad is like, "No, get back in here. We're calling an ambulance." And what's funny about that is that in my previous overdoses, I had two prior overdoses to that, a couple years apart from each other. And looking back at it, I don't think I had intentionally set out to, commit suicide or to not wake up. But that third time, I didn't care. I was going to take whatever I could. And if I didn't wake up, fine. I wouldn't wake up. That was kind of how I thought about it at the time. But I've had a lot of conversations with my parents about that experience and how it affected them because, through the recovery process, I've been grateful to be able to go back to the people that I've harmed. And usually it's the people that are really close to us and make amends for the things that I did, and the way that I treated people and the way that I harmed them. So we joke about that experience. My dad likes to remind me that I was sitting in the bathtub fully clothed, and he's asking me what I'm doing, and I told him I'm taking the car to get gas. I was From there, I went downstairs and I was trying to find my keys in the refrigerator, like all sorts of weird, awkward things that as a parent at that time, I bet my parents, they were so impacted by that. I'm just really grateful that, I've been able to make amends, and stay in recovery as a living amends to them and not act in that manner anymore. I got married early on. I want to say right around 20. That marriage didn't last very long because I could not stop using. Again, going back to the people that I hurt the most were the people closest to me. And, when I found recovery 2 years later, something was different. And I think for me, a lot of people talk about like having a spiritual awakening or an experience that really sets into motion more willingness, more open-mindedness to try things that, a doctor or someone at the hospital or a social worker or a case manager recommends. But I vividly remember I woke up in the ICU, and from there they put me up in the stabilization unit. From there, I went to detox, stayed in detox for 2 weeks, and then I went to treatment. But at the time, there was only one treatment facility in Minnesota that would work with co-occurring disorder or dual diagnosis, which just meant that, not only was I using drugs and alcohol and whatever I could get my hands on, but I had underlying depression. I had trauma. I had PTSD from things that had happened early in my childhood and in early life that, they weren't, I'll say that they were little T's, so they weren't significant traumatic experiences, but the childhood where I wasn't able to identify with other people, like a lot of that stuff, had kind of impacted me at that point. And so I remember once, I had to sit down and talk with a social worker, and she was used to Brandon because I had been court ordered to treatment one time prior to that. And this is how I remember it. We were in the stabilization unit, and basically they're saying, "Brandon, you have to go to treatment. We are going to force you to go to treatment again, because you basically attempted to end your own life with this past overdose." And the argument got heated. I was challenging it a little bit, but at some point I kind of just broke and I said, "Listen," I'm like, stop right now. I will go to treatment and I will get help, but you have to get me out of this town." And I think that was a very important thing that even I was able to identify with, because the treatment programs that I had been to, one of them had got shut down not too long after my previous treatment experience there. But I knew I needed something away from people, places, and things, because it's so easy for some individuals and for, an addict like me to be able to go back to the people, go back to the places, and participate in the things or activities that I know are eventually going to lead me down a road of relapse. And that's something that I did not want. And I'm grateful I was able to have that conversation with my social worker at that point. And then from there, really, the other most, I want to say, impactful moment for me was when I had to go to court. So because I was court ordered, I had to show up my parents brought me to court. No, they didn't. I take that back. My parents brought me from court to treatment, but I was brought to court by a sheriff's deputy in handcuffs. And that's the first time I had ever been handcuffed in my entire life. And it scared the bejesus out of me. I'm fortunate that I never really got caught when I was in active addiction. But I had my stay in hospitals and inpatient units and treatment programs, and I'm grateful for that. But when I got to that courtroom, I really had tunnel vision, and I remember that basically the entire state of Minnesota knew that I had a problem, but I was the last to know. So that was a very powerful moment for me. And from there, I just I was a lot more open-minded. I started praying regularly. You could call it meditation, but today I pray and I meditate regularly, daily if possible, if I remember, depending on how stressful my day goes. But I think for me, a big piece of that surrender was because my higher power showed up for me and I didn't even know he was there. So I'm extremely grateful for that. I went through the treatment process, and this time I actually listened. So, all the previous treatment experience I'd call my mom, I'd call someone else, come and get me, I'm out of here. I would just leave against staff advice and I'm gone, only to be back there a month later and do the same thing. But this time, I stuck with it. I went through the full detox. I went through residential treatment. And at the time, I was at a dedicated program where men were here and females were here. And I'm grateful for that. It allowed me to really kind of focus on building relationships with other guys and other males in recovery. Again, going back to that codependent piece, I think I was extremely codependent, especially when you're looking at it from the relationship standpoint. So that was very helpful for me. I was fortunate enough to have a really cool therapist when I went through my primary treatment experience that time. And when I graduated treatment, I learned that she'd become a psychotherapist. And I'm like, what is this psychotherapy stuff? That sounds interesting. I learned a little bit about CBT, or cognitive behavioral therapy, that focuses on thoughts, feelings, and emotions, and just kind of like the stinking thinking and the thinking that goes on. But I went back to see her then for a couple of years afterwards to continue with one-on-one therapy. And I think that was one of the best things I could have ever done. In conjunction with going to meetings, finding a sponsor. I think for me, I didn't really know where I fit in. Again, going back to what I knew as a child. So I went to AA, I went to NA, I went to EA, I went to any A you could think of, and trying it out, because when I was using, I'd try out any substance that I could. So I had to put, that energy that I put into actively using and finding ways and means to get more, to actually finding ways and means to stay clean and stay in recovery. And I'm grateful for that. I went to a lot of different meetings, and I eventually found a fellowship that ends in an A that I feel very comfortable with. And I have a sponsor to this day that I've continually worked the steps over and over again, because this is a lifelong process. And I think that was something that I had never done before. I think trust was very difficult for me early on. I didn't really have a lot of people in my life besides my mom and dad and my little sister that I could trust. But I started working through the 12 steps and started working with my sponsor and started to do some service work, and like, what is this? Wow, why do I feel so good about my life? And I want to say there was a spiritual awakening somewhere in that first 30 to 50 days, because I remember going back to my room after a day of treatment, looking at my roommate, and I said, dude, I haven't thought about getting high at all today. And I'm like, what is that? Like, whoa, really? I think that was that day like 43 or 44, somewhere in there. But that was another powerful, like, mini spiritual awakening that I had. And I'm grateful for that, because prior to that, all I ever cared about from sun up to sundown was, where can I get high? What can I use? Who can I manipulate? Who can I con? What can I do? Me, I. And there's a lot of selfishness that I didn't realize I had until I started to work through recovery and really figure out, who am I now, without drugs, without alcohol, without manipulation, without all these other things. And that was a very powerful moment when I realized I didn't think about getting high at all today. I'm like, are you kidding me? That's possible? Come on. I used for about 10 years. And I'm like, oh my goodness, this was just a really cool experience. So I'm grateful for
Awesome.
that. Yeah.
It's so funny because that's what I say, and so many good nuggets. I'm like, okay, don't interrupt. I want to hear all.
Sorry.
No, it's really good, but that's what I say. A lot of times to my clients, in either one-on-one or in groups, is like, to me, true recovery is when you get to that place where you're not thinking about drinking and using all the time,
Yeah.
or even at all. Right. And it's awesome that you said it just like that, because I literally say that all the time. And so I love that. But so many good nuggets, and I'll jump in, but go ahead and keep going.
Yeah, sure. No, and I think, from there were some other significant things that happened once I found recovery, found a fellowship, started working through a program of recovery. And not just that, but going to therapy, I found out that I really like exercise. So I started exercising, got a gym membership, became a personal trainer, and did a lot of races and a lot of exercise. I became an exercise person, and I'm like, wow, I didn't know I liked exercise. But another important thing for me that I talk a lot about with other guys in recovery and people that I work with from a recovery aspect, it was important for me to have some goals. Like, I had never had a college education. My parents paid for me to go one semester, and I remember driving past the high school. I pulled up to a stop sign, and I'm like, I could go to class today, or I could go home and finish getting high. What do you think I did? Whipped a Yui, drove back home, and I got high. Never went back to college. Ended up dropping out, and so, college education was something that was extremely important to me. So I enrolled in some classes at St. Cloud State University, and it was probably the coolest thing I could have done. I got to, find peers that were in recovery. I got to meet other people that had, passions similar to mine, whether that was exercise or education or recovery or just normal people. And I had started to pick up some tools and really be able to have relationships and have conversations and talk to other people about how I was feeling. So, going back to school, I think was something that, even though, student loan is still there and there's still student debt, I wouldn't change it for anything, because it introduced me to a lot of really cool things that I still use in my life today. And I'm grateful for that. The relationship was also another important piece for me. Pretty early on, I'll say about 6 months, which can be too soon for some people. Most recommend not getting into a severe relationship until you have a year under your belt. So don't do what I did, but no, just kidding. I was fortunate enough to, find another individual that I could relate to, and it wasn't, there weren't any strings attached. It was just somebody that I could have a conversation with, and I could talk about recovery, and that was passionate about a lot of the things that I was passionate about. And that has continued to be a theme in my recovery, where now that individual, who still supports me, is my wife, and we have a beautiful son together, and we have another son coming in March of 2022. And I'm extremely grateful that, going back to that whole family dynamic and having relationships, that boundaries were held and conversations were had, and just that, intimate conversation that we have with individuals took place. And so I'm extremely grateful, not only for my family today, but for my family that has supported me this entire process and not really given up on Brandon, because if anyone gives up on Brandon, it's usually me first, to be completely honest. And so that accountability has really been a huge part of my recovery, and so have those relationships.
Awesome. Oh my God, that was so good. I get so excited. I always learn things that I don't know. Of course, I know a lot of your story, but it's always fun. I didn't know you were a personal trainer. So
Yes.
That's new for me. But I mean, so many good nuggets in that story. And what I love is that each of the people that I've interviewed have such a different story. And my fourth person is going to have an even more different story. But it was really cool because you're the first person that I interviewed so far this year that did go to treatment and that went to treatment more than once. And so a lot of people who struggle with that, it can be really challenging. So it's nice to hear, someone who went through that struggle and then has been able to stay sober for how many years is it?
So 13 and a half. I'll have 14 years in January, God willing.
That's so awesome.
Yeah.
I love that. And just so well-rounded. And, when I talk about it in therapy, we talk about the biopsychosocial model of treatment and recovery and life in general. And looking at all aspects of yourself as a biological, psychological, social, and spiritual being. And you talked about all of those pieces and having, having co-occurring disorders and addressing, the fellowship and the support, the social support, and how important that is, and the not feeling alone, because there's so many people, that really feel like no one else is going through what I'm going through.
Yeah. Yeah, that the social aspect I think is important. You made me think of like having the tool and the tools in the toolbox, right? And I use that analogy a lot because I have really close friends that definitely have more tools than me, and I have more tools than some other people or less than other individuals. But for me, those tools have always, and I say always, since my last date of use, January 14th, 2008. Since then, my tools have looked like going to a 12-step fellowship, having a sponsor in my life that I can talk to and I can really get raw and vulnerable with, taking care of my physical health. I've had a gym membership, I want to say, since month 3 of my recovery in some capacity. I've made sure I went to the dentist, I went to the doctor, I took care of my physical health. When I was going through my spiritual phase, I did a lot of different things. I tried yoga, I tried candle gazing, where you stare at the candlelight and close your eyes. I read a lot of stuff on different faiths, Buddhism. I tried all these different things. I still have a CD somewhere of Buddhist monks chanting, and I loved it. Like, there was a part of me that didn't know how beautiful spirituality really was. And to this day, like meditation, prayer, whatever that looks like for me, sometimes just going for a run and having that connection outside with nature, with the sun beating down on me, like that's spirituality for me. And my definitions of spirituality have definitely continued to change, and so is my relationship with my higher power. And that's the cool thing about recovery is you kind of get to define and shape and create what your recovery looks like to you, and especially that spiritual piece. And so that has always been a huge component of my recovery. And I wanted to go back because when you said I was the first person that had been to multiple treatments before, not only just multiple treatments, but I didn't find recovery willingly. I was court ordered twice. So part of my story is that I didn't want to find recovery. I didn't care. I didn't want to. But I'm so grateful that the legal processes that got me to treatment, in a sense, forced me to comply, were there, because had they not, I wouldn't have woken up that next time.
Oh, I have goosebumps.
And yeah, me too. Like, that's the reality of this, is like, I wasn't going to stop no matter what. And I think that that's something that I don't ever want to take for granted. I think I've actually reached out to my social worker that committed me both times through social media, and just I think I sent her a card, I think the first or second year in recovery. And I just said, hey, so-and-so, I'm sorry I was such a pain in the ass when I was, drinking and drugging, but I want to tell you today that I'm extremely grateful and I'll never forget you, because if you wouldn't have done what you did, I would not be where I am today in my life. And so once a year, every year, she sends me a little message and says, just thinking of you, hope all is well. And I'm like, that stuff just melts my heart. Because again, going back to the people we harm when we're in active addiction, we hurt a lot of people. And I think making amends was something that was extremely important to me and allowed me to kind of heal through a lot of the experiences that I had not been a very positive participant in.
Well, and speaking as a therapist on the other end of that, a lot of times it's the people who do that, because I have a few myself that do that send me, not a lot, but I'm hoping there will be more. But it really means so much to me to hear that, just, hey, I'm sober, I'm doing well, here's what of course I love hearing from them, even if they're not doing well, but to be able to hear that they're sober and doing well is just amazing. So I love that you do that. I'm sure that means a lot to her.
Yeah, really and I think part of that is number one, making, in that case, I felt comfortable enough to make like a formal amends and say, hey, I'm sorry for being such a piece of garbage and thank you for putting up with me. But I think on the other end of that, like, there are other individuals that it was not safe for me to go back and say, hey, I'm so sorry for doing X, Y, and Z to you, because it would have created more harm.
Right.
And so I'm grateful that because of the 12-step fellowship, because of recovery, I'm able to now make living amends. And to me, that just means don't do that stuff again,
Oh,
try and be a better person,
yeah. I think that's
and
one of the best things about your story, and then one of the best things about you, because I know you fairly well, and just that you're always growing. You're always seeking to be a better person, and that's such a testimony to you as a person, especially, but to recovery, and that it is a process. It's not just about being sober. It's about living a good life. It's about being the best person that you are, like the truest you, so to speak. And I love that you spoke to all the aspects, and I actually didn't fully catch the significance of you having been court ordered twice, because I think that's a discussion that happens a lot, is that, oh, being court ordered treatment doesn't work. Well, your testimony that it does work, and I think that's awesome. And it took a lot of courage, to those people to court order you for treatment. So, and just speaking to, again, back to that biopsychosocial spiritual piece, addressing all those pieces of yourself. So getting the therapy and doing the treatment and doing the fellowship and the 12-step, and just having that well-rounded recovery, the exercise, all of those things, eating well, taking care of yourself in every aspect of your life is really what's most important. And I love that. My favorite thing about doing these interviews is that I never have to steer it in that direction, because all, like, you share that, and you have that well-rounded experience, and share that it does work. Because I do see a lot of people, I do a lot more private practice than residential treatment now, but a lot of times when people are in residential treatment, they get out of treatment, they're like, I'm so done with treatment. Because it's super intense, right? You get all this stuff at once, you have to deal with all your crap at one time. Yeah. And like, okay, I'm tired, and it's exhausting, I get it. But then they tend to fall off because they don't continue that process of whatever their recovery program looks like, because it looks like different things for different people. It might be recovery, celebrate recovery, any of the 12 step fellowships. And any other support system, along with treating the mental health, because even if you didn't start out with mental health symptoms, although I would argue that most people do,
I would agree,
just through the addiction process, you end up, alcohol is a depressant, so it can certainly create depression, and it messes with your chemistry in your brain, and you start with kind of a level of those feel-good chemicals, and then they kind of get a little lower, and they get a little lower, and they get really depleted. So you have that anxiety, the depression, and a lot of people, throughout their addiction, don't just have little T's traumas, they have big T's, right? And it's really more about what you consider trauma, but for a lot of people, it's very, very traumatic being in that space. And so and for me, from my experience, what I see, with people coming back to treatment is, and having difficulty staying sober when they want to stay sober, right? Because there's a difference when they're not quite ready for it yet. But a lot of times what I see is when people struggle to stay sober, it's the trauma that they're not dealing with, right? It's the difficult stuff that they were using to hide in the first place a lot of times. So it's really important. And I love that you share that piece about addressing all those aspects. And it's
I'm a pretty emotional and open book at this point in my life. I think, the things that you've just kind of hit on, I wanted to also share that, going back to that tool in the toolbox, right? For me, a couple of things stood out as you were talking, where, you're talking about folks that transition out of treatment for whatever reason, they end up back out using again, and they come back if they're fortunate enough to come back, because let's be real, not everybody that goes back out survives. And that's just a fact of addiction and substance use disorder. But I think for me, when I left treatment, that's when the recovery process really happened, because going to a safe, secure environment where my meals are made, housekeeping provided, I have everything that I need. I didn't have that when I left, so for me, recovery really started when I left, and whether or not I followed through with the decisions that I had made in treatment for my continued care. And I want to go back to when I mentioned about that therapist that I continued to see after I, post treatment. that was probably the smartest decision that this guy's ever made around, finding help and continuing therapy, because there was a couple of points in my early recovery where I'd started to do triathlons, and I was a personal trainer and did all that, exercise stuff. But then I show up to my therapist's office and I realized that I have some sort of eating disorder going on. And I had no idea, it comes out of left field. Why am I now suddenly eating a certain way after training or before training? And it turned out that I had some significant like self-image issues there. I
Mhm.
wanted to be this really big, strong, muscular six-pack dude that you see on a magazine. But like, let's be real, that's not a majority of us, and nor does it have to be. Like Brandon's okay in his body today. I'm really comfortable, and now I
Mhm.
can say it with my dad bod. But there were a lot of things that at that time I wanted to look, act, and feel and behave a certain way, even with 18 months, even with 3 years, even with 6 years. That I'm really grateful I had that support network in my, in my recovery community. But I also felt okay talking to a professional about it, because I think that's another thing that can be really tough for individuals. And I was fortunate enough that my therapist knew me from day one. So I felt extremely comfortable because she knew a lot of things about me that nobody else did. But to go back and to feel comfortable in that one-on-one setting with the therapist and just say, hey, look, I'm doing some things that I don't necessarily feel good about, and they're making me feel a certain way, and to not really know what those were, that was a scary feeling. So, as a male in recovery, I'm completely open in saying that I struggled with an eating disorder for a long time, right after about 18 months to 2 years into my recovery, because I had a lot of self-image issues. I wanted to be accepted. I wanted to look a certain way. And I can, successfully say that I'm in a different place today. I look in the mirror and I tell myself, like, I love you, dude. I love you, Brandon. You're a good guy. Positive affirmations, recognizing that I'm okay with who I am today. But that, again, it took a lot of work to get to that point. But I want to share that because it's okay. Life shows up when we get into recovery. It doesn't just mean that there's butterflies and unicorns and rainbows and you're going to get the best job, the best relationship, the best car, the best house. Some of us are going to have to fight really, really hard to get those things in life, and that is okay. We're putting in work, we're putting in the effort. Just by doing the next right thing, life works out.
I love that. And again, as usual, you stared at exactly where I would want to go. And, one of the questions that I ask, everybody is, for those that are still struggling and for that time, that first, because, that first couple years, that first 6 months, that first year, that first couple years where, stuff that you maybe weren't dealing with shows up or comes out, right? Because we as human beings are going to seek pleasure and avoid pain. So that's going to come out somewhere, right? What was that piece like for you, and what would you say to the person that still struggles? Like, what kind of thoughts do you have for them?
Yeah, for the person that still struggles, like it's okay. You are not alone. You're not the only one that is going through what you're going through. And I can pretty much almost guarantee that. I think there was a lot of fear in, oh my gosh, I'm not perfect, right? Because I think a lot of people equate, and I certainly did, recovery to perfection, but there's no such thing. And so, I just want to say that it's okay to ask for help. It's okay to not feel good. If you have a bad day and you are struggling, if you have to, if you lose a job or something traumatic happens, whether it's a little T or a big T, like take time for yourself to heal. If you have to set aside time at night, grab a notebook. I've been a big fan of journaling since I got into recovery, because I get stuff up here and if it's not out, it stays in there. And it's like I got a little committee in my head telling me that, I'm a bad person and, oh, you shouldn't have done that. Why did you think that way? Why did you behave that way? Why did you do that, Brandon? Why? And the journaling and prayer and meditation and just finding somebody that I'm comfortable with, to share that deep, dark, icky stuff with, I think was extremely important to me. Going back to finding and identifying a sponsor that I wanted to work with. The first gentleman that worked with me was a great guy, and it just didn't work out. I kind of sent some things, if you will, but the next individual that ended up being, a big part of my recovery and still is today was somebody that I could hear from across the rooms. Not only could I hear that this person was really struggling, but they knew what to do when they struggled, but I saw that apply in that person's life. So it wasn't just lip service to look good in a meeting. It was actually, this person is living a program of recovery, and I wanted that. I wanted to live a program of recovery. So I found somebody that, I'm comfortable being completely open and honest and vulnerable with.
Well, and that's, I appreciate that you said that, because that's something that a lot of people struggle with. And, reaching out for help is hard enough. So then when you reach out to a sponsor or a therapist, and maybe you don't connect with the first person, to not let that discourage you, because sometimes it takes 2 or 3 or 4. And that's why it's so important to have such a well-rounded support team, support system. And for some people that includes medications, and that as well, and other, like, as many tools. As you said, I use that analogy quite a bit as well, as many tools that, you have in your toolbox for the different situations. Not everything is going to require the same tools. So, man, I think you answered most of my questions. Anything else that you think would be helpful to share?
That's a good question. I think there's a lot, but I appreciate this opportunity because it kind of got me thinking, right? And I shared this with you before we started recording, but the first time I ever shared my story in a meeting, I talked for like an hour and a half, and everybody was like, bro, you got to tune it, you got to turn it down. But again, I wanted people to know who I was. I wanted to let you know that, like, my heart is on my sleeve and I'm telling you exactly who I am as a human being. And so, for me, when you think about recovery and when I think about like what my life is today, the truth is I shouldn't be here. Right. That's, at least that's what I tell myself, is I should not be where I am today. But that's a line of garbage that I tell myself when I'm not in a good place. The reality is that I deserve everything in my life today. And I'm grateful for the people that have helped me to get here. You mentioned that it's okay to try and find the right fit, whether it's a sponsor, whether it's a therapist, whether it's a treatment program. Like, not everything is going to work well for each person. I've had several experiences, especially in, moving from Minnesota to now Florida, where I had to find another therapist when I moved here. And I interviewed a couple of them, and there were some that just didn't really fit, and that is okay. But they were kind enough to provide resources and help me. And that's what I think this all goes back to is, people in a helping profession like yourself that have an amazing clinical background, personal background, you're just an amazing resource, but you're also an amazing professional. I think, as somebody in recovery, to give back to society in a similar way without expecting anything in return, like financially, is the best thing that we can do, is to continue to carry the message that, number one, recovery is possible, and number two, you're not alone. You have a lot of people that are in similar situations, and it's okay to ask for help. Now I'm just rambling, but I could talk about so many other cool recovery things with you. You're just an amazing professional, amazing friend. I appreciate this opportunity very much in honor of Recovery Month. That's a big deal. So thank you for putting all of this together.
Yeah, thank you. And maybe we'll do it again. Who knows? Maybe we'll have some other recovery talks sometime. But yeah, absolutely. I mean, I so much appreciate your story. And, just as a final thought, I don't know if you get this a lot, but from hearing that place where you really felt like you didn't know who you were, or that you didn't fit in, you didn't belong, just knowing you as an adult, not in that place, you seem, even just sharing your story, you seem so comfortable in who you are. And you present yourself as such an amazing human being. I mean, you're one of my favorite people. So I just wanted to share that with you, that, I think that is a huge testimony to the growth that you've made as a human being, as a man in recovery, despite all of the things that you've been through. And I just think that's so awesome. And again, that you were willing to share that story, because it takes a lot of guts to do that. So I really, really appreciate that so much.
Namaste.
Namaste. And I hope you guys got something out of it as well. Certainly, please don't hesitate to reach out, send messages. My information will be in the comments and all that good stuff. So definitely reach out, ask questions, and I hope you got something out of it. Thank you so much.
Thank you.